There's a fascinating interview with Dr. Saad, who is from Syria. He lived in Syria, in Lebanon, and he now lives in Montreal. And he sees the enormous amount of immigrants from Muslim countries, and he makes this fascinating point that in the same way in relationships, and this is something that's very true to the religious Jewish community, we build our dating and marriages on values. That's the first thing that we want to align before we even start dating. We want to make sure that we have the same value system. When you have immigrants coming into a country who have a different value system, then the relationship, the marriage can't work. And that's what's happening in so many countries as immigration is being permitted. And you have Muslims with completely different value system that don't accept the value system of their host. And that creates a tremendous danger. Let's hear it in his own very eloquent words.
Within our lifetime, right? Lebanon was about 65% Christian, and now it's flipped the other way around. It's about 65% Muslim. And it didn't take 500 years. It took, 40, 50 years. And so things can quickly change. And usually you can predict, there's a book by a gentleman by the name of, he's a missionary from Africa. His name is Peter Hammond. He wrote a book a few years ago where he looked at what happens to a society as a function of the percentage of people who are of the Islamic faith. 0 to 2%, or they're just a exotic minority, 3 to 5%. They're a bit more politically, motivated, but they're still pretty quiet. And you could predict it as easily as the trajectory of diabetes, right? With more Islam comes more problems. And at one point you close your eyes, you open them, and then the whole society is Islamic.
What would you do if you were Prime Minister of Canada?
So certainly no one can stay in Canada who does not share the foundational deontological principles of Canada, right? So there can't be a two-tier system where we can criticize vigorously any religion except one, because that would be Islamophobic. There is a motion that was passed at the table called M103 that, can make it very difficult to criticize Islam, because you would be spreading hate and division and lack of community cohesion, and that was under Justin Trudeau. So I would certainly halt immigration from any society that does not share our values. Look, I'll give you an analogy from evolutionary psychology. And when you're choosing a mate, one of the best ways to ensure that you're going to have a successful marriage is what's called assortative mating, meaning birds of a feather flock together. If I share the same values as my mate, I'm much more likely to have, it's not difficult to understand, right? Well, you could apply that exact same mechanism. I call it cultural homophily, cultural liking of similar others, right? So you're much more likely to integrate people from Denmark or Sweden or Estonia, not because they may share your skin hue or not, but because they're likely to share some of those foundational values that the West was built on. Regrettably, many other societies don't. And so I would certainly reduce that greatly, and I would very vigorously deport anyone who adheres to those kinds of antithetical principles.
Do you think the average Canadian is just kind of sitting around like, Trump save us at this point? I mean, Trudeau showed up to Mar-a-Lago just a couple days ago and basically kissed the ring, and now it sounds like even he's going to do something as it pertains to the border and everything else.
I hate to say this because I like to always be smiling and optimistic, but I also like to be truthful.
Yeah.
I'm not very optimistic for the following reason. So I can walk in my neighborhood in Montreal, which is, there are a lot of Jews. There are a lot of people who support my message, who'll come up to me, who are fans. Dear Dr. Saad, I love you for reasons X, Y, Z. The next question I ask him, do you mind if I ask who you vote for? Oh, I voted for the Liberal Party. So that disconnect, I love you, Dr. Saad, but I voted for the Liberal Party, and I will continue to do so for the next 17 generations. And there will never be any autocorrection in my political voting behavior. How could you resolve the problem if I can never get you to change your behavior?
So do you see any way, I mean, not just with Canada, but with, say, Germany and France and Denmark and some of these other countries going through this, do you see any solution that ultimately is not violent to this? Because it seems to me that the people who either have suicidal empathy or ostrich parasitic syndrome, that it's almost too late. It might have not been too late 10 years ago to have dealt with this appropriately, but now, as you mentioned, it's a numbers game. that I don't see a real way to get out of.
I don't either. And when you and I have known each other now for probably about a decade,
Yeah.
and certainly a decade before that, if not more, I'd been saying that if we continue on this trajectory, we're going to have a repeat of the Beirut that I escaped. And people would say, that's such an exaggeration. That's so hyperbolic. That's so silly. I understand you had, this childhood trauma. Don't project it onto the West. It'll never happen. Well, you have to have the imagination to be able to extrapolate these patterns, right? It won't happen next year. It won't happen in 10 years, but give it enough time and it has to happen. There's no right? So we won't amputate your legs the first day you get diabetes, but let it rage far enough and it will lead to the amputation of your limbs. That's what's going to happen.
So what do you make about what happened here in America? Because again, I think we really looked at the abyss and decided not to do it. I think
Hey, you know what he's pointing? They're bringing up a very, very critical point, and that is that when we see things moving in a very dangerous direction, we must take action. Whatever those actions may be or are required, we must take action. And very often, while we're standing on the side and observing it, we have our hands in our pockets and we're not doing anything about it. Every one of us has to ask ourselves what we do when we see the evil being perpetrated in the world, like what's going on in Israel, with Gaza. And are we doing something about it? Are we at least being vocal, right? Or we're still quiet? Whereas, unfortunately, many Jews have become fearful because of the increase in anti-Semitism, and they're hiding their Jewishness. Now's the time not to hide your Jewishness. Now's the time to actually expose your Jewishness. We need to be bolder now in reaction to that's the only way we're going to stop what we see playing out in front of us.